Why Ann Coulter is the greatest champion of Black American rights. I'm going to say something that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And honestly, good. Discomfort is usually where the interesting stuff lives anyway. Ann Coulter, conservative firebrand, provocateur, the woman who has made her career out of saying things that even make Republicans shift nervously in their seats, might be the greatest ally Black Americans had in this country right now. She doesn't know it. She probably wouldn't like it. And yet here you are. Stick with me. Section 1. Who is Ann Coulter and why should I care? For those of you who don't know Ann Coulter, let me give you the quick version. Ann Coulter is a conservative political commentator, lawyer, and author. She's a fixture in American political media since the 1990s and has written books such as Adios America. She is not a subtle person. She does not traffic in nuance. She says what she thinks loudly, and she has spent a significant portion of her career arguing that mass immigration is one of the greatest threats to the United States of America. Now, most people, especially most Black people, hear that and immediately categorize Ann Coulter as the enemy. And I get it. On the surface, a woman who has spent decades rallying against immigration and multiculturalism doesn't exactly read as a friend to communities of color. But here's the thing about arguments. Sometimes an argument leads somewhere its author didn't intend. Sometimes you find a line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, and you end up somewhere the person who started it never expected to go. That's what happened to me when I started really sitting with what Ann Coulter actually argues. Not the hot takes, not the Twitter moments, the actual substance of her case. Because if you take Ann Coulter's argument seriously, if you follow it all the way down, it doesn't lead where she thinks it leads. It leads to us. Section 2, the foundation, what the 14th Amendment actually says. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you thought seriously about the 14th Amendment? Not as a political talking point, not something you vaguely remember from high school, but as a document, as a legal and historical artifact that's written by specific people for a specific reason at a specific moment in American history. Most people, including a lot of Black people, treat the 14th Amendment as a general civil rights document, a universal guarantee of equal protection. And look, that's how it's been interpreted over time, but that's not what it was written to do. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. It was written explicitly to resolve one question: what is the legal status of Black Americans? People who have been enslaved, people who have been legally defined as property, people whose entire existence in this country have been structured around their exclusion from citizenship. The amendment says all people born or naturalized in the United States and subject to a jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Now that sounds universal, and courts have since applied it broadly. But the real reason this amendment existed at all was Black Americans. Specifically, the people whose citizenship had been denied, whose humanity had been denied, whose claim on this country had been denied for over 200 years. And here's the thing I think gets lost. Black Americans didn't arrive in America. They were brought here. Their labor built this country. They were listing the founding documents not as citizens, not as people exactly, but as property, as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation, which means they were foundational to the political architecture of this nation from the very beginning. Booker T. Washington understood this. People talk about Washington like he was the accommodationist, the one who said, just put your head down and work. And look, you can critique his politics. But Booker T. Washington was one of the major black voices to sound the alarm about mass immigration and what it meant for black Americans. He understood that every wave of new arrivals was going to be positioned above black Americans and the social hierarchy. That employers were going to use immigrant labor to undercut black workers. That black people who had the oldest and deepest claim on this country were going to keep getting pushed to the back of the line in favor of people who had just arrived. Was he right? Yeah, he was right. So where does Coulter come in? Coulter argues loudly, repeatedly, in multiple books that mass immigration has fundamentally transformed America in ways that are never authorized by its founding population. The country belongs, in some essential sense, to the people who were here at its founding and their descendants. She's making an argument about roots, about legitimacy, and who has the oldest claim. And you take that argument seriously, if you really mean it, the answer isn't white immigrants from Europe who arrived in the 19th and 20th century. The answer is black Americans who were here from the beginning, whose presence is written to the founding documents, and whose citizenship was explicitly constitutionalized by the 14th Amendment. Ann Coulter has been making that argument for us. She just doesn't know it yet. Section 3, my personal journey. I want to be honest with you here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this kind of video worth watching. I didn't always think this way. For a long time, I accepted the framework I was handed. The framework that said black Americans and immigrant communities are natural political allies. That we share the same struggle. That the enemy is the same for all of us. The solution is coalition politics. And there's something to that. There genuinely is. I'm not dismissing it entirely. But the more I looked at it, the more I started to notice that this coalition didn't always seem to benefit black Americans the way it benefited everyone else. That black Americans kept finding themselves at the bottom of hierarchies, even within supposedly progressive coalitions. There are specific history, the slavery, the Jim Crow, the constitutional amendments written in our name, kept getting subsumed into a broader narrative of immigrant struggle that didn't quite fit. I also, and I'm going to be honest about this, went through a period where I was drawn to certain theories about race and intelligence. The IQ arguments, the bell curve stuff. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen either. Because I think a lot of people go through versions of that and never talk about it, and silence makes it worse. What changed my mind wasn't a single moment. It was accumulation. It was watching the same people who cited those IQ statistics to explain black dysfunction go completely silent when the opioid epidemic started devastating white communities. Suddenly, addiction was a disease. Suddenly, these were victims who deserved compassion and treatment, not criminals who deserved incarceration. And I kept thinking about Rodney King, about the crack epidemic, about the 80s and 90s, when black communities were experiencing levels of dysfunction and crisis and pain that people like Charles Murray were attributing to genetic inferiority. And the response from the political establishment was not compassion. It was war. The war on drugs, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, mass incarceration. Where was the compassion then? The opioid epidemic didn't prove that white people are as intelligent as Murray claimed black people were. It proved that dysfunction follows poverty and hopelessness regardless of who you are. It proved that variables Murray was measuring were social, not genetic. And it proved that compassion and the policy response had always been about who the victims are and whether they matter to people in power, not about the nature of the problem itself. I say all of this because my journey to this argument about Ann Coulter ran through that territory. It ran through my own assumptions, my own wrong turns, my own gradual recognition that the frameworks I've been handed, both the progressive ones and the ones I picked up from less reputable corners of the internet, weren't exactly serving black Americans. The framework that serves black Americans is the one that takes our history seriously. The one that says we were here first, we built this country, and our claim on it is constitutionally grounded in the way that no other group's claim is. Section 4, the uncomfortable implication. Now let's get to the part that's going to make people on both sides of the aisle uncomfortable. If Ann Coulter's restrictionism is correct, if America has a founding stock with a legitimate claim on an institution, its culture, and its political life, then black Americans are part of that founding stock. Not metaphorically, legally, constitutionally. The 14th Amendment was not an immigration document. It was not written to extend citizenship to future arrivals. It was written to fix a specific injustice done to a specific people who have been in this country since it was a country. Now, I want to be careful here. I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, okay, but the WASP establishment also oppressed black Americans for most of its existence. You're not wrong. The same constitutional architecture that eventually recognized black citizenship was also used for generations to deny it. The people who built the architecture owned enslaved people. The contradiction is real, and it's not nothing. But here's the distinction I want to make. I'm not asking you to romanticize the WASP ruling class. I'm asking you to look at the constitutional architecture they built and notice that black Americans are in it explicitly by amendment in a way that later immigrant groups simply are not. The descendants of Italian immigrants who came to Ellis Island in 1905 don't have an amendment written specifically about them. The descendants of Mexican immigrants who came in the latter half of the 20th century don't have an amendment written specifically about them. Black Americans do. Adios America is Ann Coulter arguing that mass immigration is destroying the country that the founding generation built. Fine, I'm not here to attack or defend that book in full. But if that argument is true, then the people with the strongest standing in that founding generation's country are the people the Constitution explicitly named, and that's us. The irony, and I mean the real irony, not the wired down version people use on the internet, is that the political tradition most likely to dismiss Black Americans as a social problem, most likely to attribute our struggles to our own failings, most likely to oppose the policies that would actually address the structural damage of slavery and segregation, that tradition is also the one whose own arguments taken seriously and followed to the logical conclusion recognize Black Americans as the most constitutionally grounded group in this country. They've been making that argument for us. They just can't see it because they can't see us. Section 5. So what do we do with this? So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with a few things. First, Black Americans need to stop treating our political interests as automatically identical to every immigrant community's political interests. That's not hostility to immigrants. That's clarity about the fact that our claim on this country is different, historically legal, constitutionally different, and we should be able to articulate that defense without apology. Second, the constitutional argument for Black Americans' full civic inclusion, including reparations, including the full realization of what the 14th Amendment promised, is stronger than most people realize. It doesn't have to be made as a favor. It doesn't have to be made as charity. It can be made as a matter of constitutional fidelity. These rights were promised. This country has not kept its promise. That's not a progressive talking point. That's just a text. Third, and maybe most importantly, we should be willing to follow arguments wherever they lead, even when they lead somewhere unexpected, even when they lead through Ann Coulter. I'm not saying Ann Coulter's on our side. I'm saying her argument is, and that should tell us something about how we've been thinking about our own position in this country. Keep looking for allies among people who say they support us. And maybe we should start paying closer attention to the arguments that support us, regardless of who's making them. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't who loves Black America. The question is who's right about Black Americans' claim on this country. Now that question, the Constitution is pretty clear.